The last cabin whispers of the Skinwalker. The sun hung low in the sky as the Davis family wound down the narrow, uneven road that cut through the dense forest. Each twist and turn seemed to pull them deeper into a world untouched by modern life. A place where cell phone signals faded, and the usual hum of city noise was swallowed up by a profound, pressing silence. They hadn't seen another car in miles, and the vast, towering trees crowded closer around them, their branches casting long, twisted shadows. In the back seat, Jamie, their 10-year-old daughter, peered out the window, wide-eyed and curious. She clutched her stuffed owl close, though her gaze flicked from the darkening woods back to her mother. "Are we almost there?" she asked, a hint of nervous excitement in her voice. Her mother, Sarah, glanced back and offered a reassuring smile. "Almost, honey. Just a few more minutes." She turned to her husband, Daniel, who gripped the steering wheel with one hand while studying a crumpled map in the other. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Daniel nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Yeah, I think so." He let out a shaky breath, forcing a smile. "The agent said it's the last cabin on this road. Once we pass a creek, it should be right there." But his voice carried an edge of uncertainty, a tone that matched the eerie quiet around them. They'd spent the past few months searching for an escape from city life, something quiet and remote, where they could reconnect as a family. The cabin had seemed perfect in the photos, a quaint, rustic home surrounded by nature, miles away from the noise and stress of urban life. But as the woods grew darker, the photos felt like a distant dream. Finally, the car crested a small hill, and there it was, the cabin, standing alone against the shadowed backdrop of trees. It was older than they'd imagined, its wooden boards weathered and warped, the roof sagging slightly under a thick layer of pine needles. A stone chimney jutted from one side, and the windows, dark and vacant, seemed to stare back at them like empty eyes. As they pulled into the dirt driveway, a figure emerged from behind a tree near the edge of the property, a hunched, wiry man with deep lines etched into his face. He wore a faded flannel shirt and a hat pulled low over his brow, casting his face in shadow. Daniel rolled down the window, cautiously. The man stepped closer, his gaze flicking over each of them before settling on Daniel. "Evening," he greeted in a gravelly voice. He didn't smile, just studied them with a somber intensity that made Sarah shift uncomfortably in her seat. "Evening," Daniel replied, trying to keep his tone friendly. "You must be the caretaker." The man nodded slowly. "Some call me that. Name's Carl." He looked past them to the cabin. "You folks plan on staying here for long?" Daniel hesitated. "A week, maybe 2. We thought it'd be a nice place to get away, peaceful and all." He chuckled nervously, but the man didn't join in. Carl's gaze darkened, and he shifted from one foot to the other. "Ain't too many folks come out this far anymore. Forests can get strange at night." He paused, his eyes narrowing as if choosing his words carefully. "If you hear anything after dark, voices or sounds that seem familiar, ignore them. Don't go looking." Jamie, who had been quietly listening, frowned. "Why? Are there animals around?" Carl's gaze softened just slightly, but he still didn't smile. "Something like that," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at Daniel, then Sarah, his eyes sharp and piercing. "Just stay inside after sundown. Keep the doors locked. And whatever you do, don't answer any voices that sound like family you hear." A cold chill settled over the group, and Daniel managed to make a stiff nod. "We'll keep that in mind." With a final, lingering look at each of them, Carl turned and shuffled back toward the trees. They watched him disappear into the shadows, his figure blending into the darkness until he was gone. Daniel cleared his throat, forcing a laugh. "Friendly guy, huh?" he joked, though his voice was strained. He climbed out of the car and started unloading their bags, shaking off the lingering unease Carl had left behind. Sarah took Jamie's hand and led her toward the cabin, trying to project a sense of calm. But as they climbed the creaking steps, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, hidden in the silent, waiting woods. Inside, the cabin was even darker than it appeared from the outside. Dust floated in the faint shafts of light that managed to slip through the thickly grimed windows. The interior had the unmistakable scent of old wood and forgotten places, mingled with a faint, earthy smell, as though the forest itself had seeped into the very walls. Daniel flipped a light switch by the door, and the single bulb overhead flickered weakly to life. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, shifting uneasily as the light swayed. Jamie wrinkled her nose. "It smells weird," she whispered. "It's just an old cabin, sweetheart," Sarah replied, though she glanced uneasily around the dim space. "We'll open some windows, let in some fresh air." She moved across the room and pushed open a window, letting in a draft that sent a shiver through her. Outside, the trees rustled faintly, though there was no breeze. It was as if the forest itself was whispering. Daniel set down their bags and surveyed the room. The furniture was a sparse and utilitarian couch with sagging cushions, a small table with mismatched chairs, and a stone fireplace lined with faded photographs of people they didn't recognize. The walls were decorated with old hunting trophies, antlers that cast sinister shadows in the weak light. "All right," he said, clapping his hands in an attempt to lift the mood. "It's rustic, but it's cozy, right?" Jamie offered a small smile, though her gaze kept drifting back to the darkened windows. "I guess," Sarah forced a cheerful tone, "it'll be an adventure. Let's unpack and then explore a bit, okay?" They spent the next hour settling in, arranging their belongings and trying to get comfortable. But no matter how much they moved things around or tried to brighten the space, the cabin's oppressive atmosphere lingered like a silent, brooding presence. As evening settled, the temperature in the cabin dropped. Daniel built a small fire in the stone fireplace, the crackling flames casting a warm, flickering glow. They gathered around, sharing stories and laughter, though each of them felt the unspoken tension hanging in the air. Outside, darkness crept up like a tide, swallowing the last of the daylight. The forest became an impenetrable black mass, stretching endlessly in all directions. The only sounds were the popping of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling into itself. Finally, Jamie yawned, rubbing her eyes. "Can I go to bed?" she asked, casting one last wary glance at the windows. Sarah nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. Your room is down the hall." Jamie hesitated, as if she didn't want to walk down the shadowy corridor alone. Sarah caught the look and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I'll tuck you in," she said, giving her daughter a reassuring smile. The small bedroom was sparse, with a twin bed pushed up against one wall and a dresser with a cracked mirror opposite it. Jamie climbed under the covers, and Sarah sat beside her, smoothing her hair. "Are you okay, honey?" she asked softly. Jamie nodded, though her eyes lingered on the door. "Do you think that man was serious about hearing things outside?" Sarah hesitated. "I think he was just trying to be careful. You know how some people out here tell stories to keep folks from wandering too far into the woods at night. But we're safe here. Your dad and I are right down the hall." Jamie nodded, though she didn't look convinced. Sarah leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Get some sleep, okay? Tomorrow, We'll explore the forest together. See if we can spot any animals." Jamie smiled faintly. "Good night, Mom." Sarah clicked off the light, leaving the door open just a crack before returning to the main room. She found Daniel sitting by the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the flames as if lost in thought. "Long day," he murmured as she settled beside him. She sighed, resting her head on his shoulder. "Yeah, this place I don't know. It's beautiful, but there's something about it." He gave a soft chuckle. "The haunted woods vibes getting to you already?" She swatted his arm lightly. "Maybe a little. I just feel like we're being watched." They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, listening to the soft crackling of the fire. The silence was so complete it felt heavy, pressing in on them from all sides. Sarah found herself glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see something moving outside. Then, in the quiet, a soft sound drifted in from the woods, a distant, faint voice calling out. Her head snapped up, and she looked toward the door. Daniel tensed beside her. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Sarah nodded, her pulse quickening. The voice came again, slightly louder, though still faint and distorted. It sounded almost familiar, like Jamie's voice, calling from the trees. Her heart pounded as she exchanged a glance with Daniel. He stood slowly, his eyes narrowing as he listened. "Sounds like Jamie," he muttered, moving toward the window. "Wait," Sarah whispered, urgently, grabbing his arm. "She's in bed." I tucked her in myself. The voice came again, clearer this time, drifting through the darkness like a whisper carried on the wind. "Mom, Dad." Daniel's face went pale, and he took a step back from the window. "What is going on?" he whispered. Sarah held her breath, her eyes fixed on the shadowy forest beyond the cabin walls. The voice came once more, closer now, soft but insistent. "Mom, I'm lost." A chill swept through her, colder than any winter night. They knew Jamie was safe inside, yet the voice was calling to them from the trees, beckoning them into the darkness. Daniel swallowed hard, his hand tightening around Sarah's. "Let's check on her," he whispered, and together they hurried down the hall to Jamie's room, fear prickling their skin. They found her there, sound asleep, her breathing soft and even. Sarah let out a shaky breath, but the dread in her chest didn't lessen. Behind them, from somewhere in the depths of the forest, the voice called out again, pleading, desperate. "Mom, Dad, please." The voice echoed through the cabin, clear as day, pleading and unmistakable. "Mom, Dad, help me." Sarah felt her blood run cold. She gripped Daniel's arm tighter, her eyes locked on Jamie, who remained undisturbed in bed, her breathing deep and even. Daniel backed out of the room, glancing over his shoulder down the hallway. "I think we should lock all the doors," he whispered. His voice, usually calm and grounded, now trembled with the same fear that knotted Sarah's stomach. Together, they moved quietly back to the living room, careful not to wake Jamie. Daniel went to the front door, checking the lock and deadbolt. Sarah double-checked the windows, pressing her hands against the cold glass, feeling the weight of the darkness outside pressing back against her. But as she drew back from the window, she caught a glimpse of something that made her heart nearly stop. Just beyond the edge of the firelight, among the trees, she saw a small, indistinct shape. It was too far to see clearly, but it looked like a child. A child standing motionless at the edge of the woods. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He joined her at the window, his gaze following hers to the shadowed figure. The small shape wavered as if it were caught between reality and shadow, flickering in and out of the darkness. It took a step forward, and Sarah's breath caught. "Mom, help," the voice called again, louder this time, and now she could see it. The figure looked just like Jamie, down to the messy braids, her favorite blue jacket, and even the stuffed owl she always carried. "Oh my God," Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She turned back toward Jamie's room, reassurance flooding her momentarily as she remembered her daughter was safely inside. But when she looked back through the window, the child that shadowed Jamie was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. "Sarah," Daniel said, his face pale, "we need to stay calm." How do we stay calm when she struggled to find words? When there's something out there pretending to be our daughter? Daniel's jaw tightened. Maybe it's just a trick of the light. Or maybe, but he trailed off, unable to finish. The rational explanations felt hollow, and he knew it as well as she did. Sarah backed away from the window, her gaze lingering on the spot where the figure had stood. What if it's what Carl warned us about? What if it's one of those things, a skinwalker? Daniel's face darkened, and he looked away. Skinwalkers are just legends, Sarah. Folktales. Are they? Her voice was almost pleading, as though she wanted him to reassure her that it was all in her head. But he couldn't meet her gaze. Another sound interrupted their fear-filled silence, a quiet scraping coming from the back door. The noise was faint, like claws against wood, but it was persistent, insistent. Sarah took a step towards it before Daniel stopped her, shaking his head. "Don't," he whispered. The scraping continued, followed by a voice, another voice that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. It was Daniel's voice, but slurred and distorted, calling from the other side of the door. "Sarah, let me in." Daniel's grip tightened on her arm as they stared at the door together. The voice repeated, closer, this time, clearer. "Sarah, let me in. I'm locked out." The words chilled her to the core. She looked up at Daniel, standing beside her, very much in the room with her, yet his voice, his exact voice, was calling to her from the other side of the door. Her mind reeled, struggling to make sense of it. She gripped his hand, her knuckles white, her heart hammering. "This can't be happening," she whispered. Daniel's gaze was fixed on the door, his eyes dark and filled with a mixture of terror and anger. He let go of her hand and took a tentative step toward the door. The voice came again, low and desperate, pleading, "Sarah, please let me in." "Don't open it," she urged, her voice barely a whisper. "Whatever it is, it's not you." He hesitated, his hand hovering near the doorknob. The voice sounded so real, so perfectly familiar. "But how? How is it doing this?" he muttered, his mind struggling to reconcile the horror. "Maybe it's what Carl meant," Sarah whispered, remembering the man's grim warning. "If you hear anything after dark, voices or sounds that seem familiar, ignore them. Don't go looking." Daniel lowered his hand, stepping back from the door. They listened as the voice continued calling, trying different tones, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, sometimes commanding. But no matter what it said, they ignored it, standing together, barely breathing, until finally the voice faded, leaving only the oppressive silence. They sat by the fire for hours, too afraid to move, too afraid to even speak. Outside, the darkness pressed against the cabin like a living thing, thick and impenetrable, hiding whatever lurked beyond. Finally, just as the first faint traces of dawn touched the horizon, they dared to let themselves relax. Daniel's shoulders sagged, and he let out a long, shaky breath. "We should try to sleep," he murmured, though his voice was still tight with lingering fear. Sarah nodded, but as she moved to stand, she caught sight of something outside the window, a faint figure moving among the trees. She froze, her heart seizing in her chest, as she realized it was the same shadowed figure of Jamie, now drifting further into the woods, her blue jacket bright against the dark backdrop. "Mom, Dad," the voice called out again, softer this time, as though it were getting further away. "Please, don't leave me here." Sarah turned to Daniel, panic in her eyes. What if that really is her?" "It's not," he said, his voice firm but trembling. "She's safe. She's in her bed. But what if it's some kind of trick? What if it's real?" He looked at her, conflicted but shook his head. "We can't go out there. Whatever it is, it wants us to follow." A hollow silence fell between them. They both knew he was right. Yet the sight of that small figure, their daughter's likeness, disappearing into the woods filled Sarah with an ache she couldn't shake. But as she glanced back toward Jamie's room, she reminded herself of the truth. Jamie was inside, safe. But the question lingered, gnawing at her. If that's not our daughter out there, then what is it? When Sarah woke, the cabin was quiet. Soft, golden light filtered through the windows, dispelling the shadows that had felt so menacing just hours before. For a brief moment, she felt a wave of relief. Maybe it had all been a terrible dream. But then the memories flooded back, the voices outside, the figure that looked like Jamie, and the twisted echo of Daniel's voice pleading from beyond the door. A shiver crept up her spine as she sat up, glancing over to where Daniel lay on the couch, his face lined with exhaustion. She gently nudged him awake. "Hey," she whispered. "It's morning." He stirred, groaning softly as he stretched. "Morning already?"
His voice was hoarse, and his eyes carried a haunted look.
"Thank God," he muttered, rubbing his face. "I thought that night would never end." They shared a moment of silent understanding, the fear of last night still lingering between them. Sarah glanced down the hallway, her heart skipping a beat. "I'll check on Jamie." Daniel nodded, watching her go, his eyes flicking to the windows, as though expecting to see something or someone outside. Sarah opened Jamie's door quietly, peeking inside. Her daughter was still asleep, curled up beneath the covers, her stuffed owl nestled under her arm. The sight brought a rush of relief, and Sarah released the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. But as she looked closer, something caught her eye. She froze, her heart racing. Across Jamie's window, pressed against the glass from the outside, were muddy handprints. Small, child-sized handprints. She backed away, her hands trembling, and motioned for Daniel. He came quickly, his expression shifting from concern to horror as he saw the prints smeared on the window. Each handprint was streaked, as though someone or something had pressed its hands there and then dragged them slowly downward. "Jamie didn't do that, did she?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel shook his head, his face pale. "She's been asleep all night." He moved closer to inspect the marks. There on the outside, Sarah's stomach churned. Last night, that thing that looked like her, it must have been here, right by her window. She felt a surge of nausea at the thought of it, watching their daughter while they were inside, oblivious. Daniel placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It couldn't get in," he said, though his voice was tense, and she could tell he was trying to convince himself as much as her. They spent the next hour scouring the cabin, checking every window and door. They found more signs of something or someone lurking close. Footprints circled the cabin, strange tracks that didn't look quite human. Some prints were unmistakably animal-clawed, four-legged, but others seemed to change midway, as though shifting from paw to human foot. Daniel knelt by a patch of disturbed soil, studying the prints with a frown. "It's like it changed shape," he murmured, tracing the outline with his fingers. "This can't be possible." A cold wind rustled through the trees, sending a whispering murmur through the branches. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around herself as she scanned the forest edge. The sunlight softened the harsh lines of the trees, but even now, in the brightness of day, the forest felt ominous, like it was hiding something within its depths, waiting and watching. They returned to the cabin, where Jamie had woken up and was sitting on the couch, her eyes wide with confusion. "Mom, Dad, what's going on?" Sarah and Daniel exchanged a glance. How could they explain last night without terrifying her? "It's just the woods," Daniel said gently, forcing a smile. "Sometimes animals come close to the cabin. Nothing to worry about." Jamie tilted her head, her expression skeptical. "But I heard voices last night. They were calling your names." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "You heard them?" Jamie nodded, clutching her owl tightly. "I thought it was you at first, Mom. But then it didn't sound right. So I just stayed in bed." Sarah knelt beside her daughter, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "You did the right thing, sweetheart." Her voice shook slightly. "If you hear anything strange again, just stay in your room, okay? Don't go to the window. Don't open the door." Jamie nodded solemnly, sensing her mother's fear. "Okay, Mom." Daniel cleared his throat, trying to change the subject. "How about we go for a hike later? Maybe explore a bit. In daylight, things will look a lot less spooky." Jamie's face brightened, and Sarah felt a brief spark of relief at the thought of a distraction. Maybe if they kept busy, the lingering fear would fade, and they'd start to feel more comfortable here. Later that day, the family set out on a narrow trail that wound through the dense forest, eager to shake off the lingering dread. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional chirping of a bird or rustle of leaves in the breeze. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor, and for a time it was almost peaceful. But as they walked, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Shadows seemed to shift just beyond her line of sight, flickering like ghosts through the trees. Daniel kept his face neutral, but his eyes darted to every sound, every rustle. Jamie skipped ahead. Her earlier fear was forgotten in the excitement of exploring. She paused to inspect a patch of wildflowers, then continued up the trail, her footsteps light and carefree. Sarah envied her daughter's innocence, her ability to brush off the night's horrors with the easy resilience of youth. Suddenly, Jamie froze, staring at something just off the path. Sarah hurried to her side, her heart pounding. "What is it, honey?" Jamie pointed silently, her face pale. In the underbrush, nestled among the roots of a large tree, lay a small, child-sized shoe. Sarah felt a wave of cold sweep over her. The shoe was identical to the ones Jamie wore, same color, same size. She swallowed hard, glancing at Daniel, who had come up behind them. His face was grim as he took in the sight. "Jamie, are you sure you didn't lose a shoe on the way here?" Jamie shook her head. "No, both of my shoes are on," she whispered, gripping her mother's hand tightly. Sarah knelt to inspect the shoe, reaching out with a trembling hand. But as her fingers brushed the worn leather, something moved in the shadows nearby. She snapped her hand back, her gaze fixed on the spot where the darkness seemed to ripple. Then, from the depths of the forest, came a soft, familiar voice. "Mom, Dad, wait for me." Sarah's heart stopped. The voice was identical to Jamie's, but Jamie was right here, clutching her hand, her wide eyes reflecting the same horror. "Mom," Jamie whispered, her voice quivering. "Why? Why is that voice saying my words?" Sarah pulled her daughter close, backing away from the shadows as Daniel stepped protectively in front of them. The voice continued, growing softer and more desperate, as though pleading with them to come closer. "Mom, please." Daniel shook his head, his face set with grim determination. "Let's go," he murmured, guiding them quickly back down the trail. The walk back felt agonizingly slow, the echo of Jamie's voice trailing after them like a twisted specter. They didn't look back, not once, but Sarah felt the weight of a presence following them, hidden in the shadows just out of sight. By the time they reached the cabin, all three of them were pale and shaken. Daniel locked the door behind them, checking the windows, reinforcing every possible entry point. Nightfall would come soon, and they could only pray they'd survive another night in the last cabin. As dusk crept in, the cabin felt smaller, more fragile, like a frail shelter against the vast and ancient forest that encircled it. Daniel secured every lock, every window, using whatever he could find to reinforce the thin doors, furniture, old boards, even a stack of firewood he piled against the back door. Sarah gathered Jamie close, wrapping a blanket around her as they huddled near the fireplace. The air felt thick, heavy, and each crackle from the fire sounded like a warning, a reminder that darkness had returned, and with it, the horrors of the night. "Dad," Jamie's voice was a small, trembling whisper. "Will we be safe?" Daniel glanced at her, his face hard but gentle. "Yes, sweetheart, I promise." But Sarah saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the weight of the fear he was trying so desperately to keep hidden. They sat together in silence, the warmth of the fire offering little comfort against the cold dread that seemed to seep in from the walls. Outside, the forest was unnaturally still, as though holding its breath, waiting. Then came the sound, a soft scraping at the back door. Sarah tensed, clutching Jamie's hand tightly. Daniel's jaw clenched as he stepped closer to the door, his body tense, listening. The scraping was faint at first, then grew louder, more insistent, like claws raking against the wood. A voice followed, muffled but unmistakable, calling from the other side of the door. It was Sarah's voice, pleading and fearful. "Daniel, please let me in." Sarah's blood ran cold, her mind reeling. The voice was an exact replica. Her tone, her inflections, her own voice was begging from the other side, each word a mockery of her terror. "Daniel, it's so cold, please." Jamie whimpered, hiding her face in Sarah's shoulder. "Mom, make it stop," she whispered, trembling. Daniel looked back at them, his face pale. "It's just trying to get in our heads," he said softly, though his voice shook. "We just have to ignore it. Don't listen." But the voice continued, shifting from Sarah's to Jamie's. "Dad, I'm lost," the voice cried, mimicking Jamie's exact tone, her soft, fearful cadence. "Please, I can't find you." Daniel swallowed hard, his face tightening with a mixture of fury and helplessness. He moved back to the fireplace, grabbing the poker and clutching it tightly, as though it were the only thing keeping him anchored to sanity. The voice shifted again, now taking on a haunting, guttural tone, rasping and distorted. Come out," almost singing, the words stretched out in a sickening cadence. "Come to me." Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, blocking out the sound, but it was everywhere, pressing in on them, filling every corner of the cabin. Jamie whimpered beside her, and Sarah wrapped her arms around her, whispering reassurances, though her own heart thundered with fear. The minutes stretched into hours, the voices outside shifting from one family member to another, alternating between pleading, mocking, and threatening. Each call grew more desperate, more insistent, wearing down their resolve. Finally, there was silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that settled over them like a shroud. Daniel exhaled, his grip on the fire poker loosening slightly. Maybe it gave up," he whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. Sarah shook her head, her instincts screaming otherwise. "No, It's waiting. And as if on cue, there was a soft knock on the front door. 3 taps, slow and deliberate, followed by a pause, and then another series of knocks. Daniel gripped the fire poker again, his knuckles white. "Stay here," he murmured to Sarah and Jamie. He moved toward the door, his footsteps muffled on the old wooden floor. Sarah watched him, her heart pounding, 1,000 warnings screaming in her mind. The knocking stopped. A moment of tense silence hung in the air. Then, a familiar voice drifted through the door, soft and fearful. It was Carl, the caretaker's voice. "Daniel, Sarah, it's me, Carl. I came to check on you folks." Daniel froze, glancing back at Sarah. She shook her head vehemently, her eyes wide with warning. "Don't open it," she mouthed, fear twisting in her gut. But Carl's voice continued, sounding desperate. "Please, it's not safe out here. I saw it. That thing in the woods. Let me in, please." The voice sounded so real, so genuine, that Daniel's resolve wavered. He reached for the doorknob, but Sarah rushed forward, grabbing his arm. "It's not him," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "Don't let it in." He hesitated, his hand hovering over the lock, but the voice continued, more urgent now. "Please, please, it's getting closer. Let me in. I can help you." Sarah's grip tightened on Daniel's arm, her nails digging into his skin. She shook her head, her expression desperate. "It's not him," she repeated, her voice barely audible. Daniel pulled back, his face filled with anguish as he listened to the voice pleading on the other side. His shoulders slumped, and he stepped away from the door, his eyes filled with a hollow, defeated look. The voice fell silent. For a moment, there was only the crackling of the fire and the faint rustling of the wind outside. Then the voice returned, cold and mocking, a twisted, rasping imitation of Carl's tone. "Smart choice," it sneered, the words dripping with malice. The silence that followed was more oppressive than any sound. Sarah felt the weight of it pressing down on her, suffocating as though the walls of the cabin were closing in. She pulled Jamie closer, her heart pounding in her chest. They sat in silence, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. The hours dragged on, each second stretching into eternity as they waited for dawn, hoping that the light would bring an end to the nightmare. But as the first faint traces of dawn crept over the horizon, the cabin filled with a strange, unsettling calm. The voices had stopped, and the forest outside was eerily quiet, as if the night had taken all its energy with it. Daniel lowered his head, his exhaustion evident, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Maybe it's over," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. Sarah didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the window, watching the light grow. But as the morning brightened, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Outside, in the damp earth surrounding the cabin, were hundreds of footprints, all circling the house, leading from one window to another, to the doors, to Jamie's room. The marks were a twisted, chaotic mess, some human, some animal, overlapping and stretching into strange, unnatural shapes. One print stood out from the others. It was large, almost human, but with elongated fingers and sharp, claw-like nails. It had been pressed firmly into the dirt outside the front door, as though it had been standing there, waiting. Sarah backed away, her hand covering her mouth, a sickening dread twisting in her stomach. They had survived the night, but the Skinwalker wasn't done. It was waiting, lurking in the shadows, a predator biding its time. And deep down, she knew that as long as they stayed here, it would keep coming back night after night until it finally got what it wanted. As the morning sun began to rise fully over the treetops, Daniel, Sarah, and Jamie stood in the middle of the cabin, looking at each other with hollow, exhausted eyes. The fear from the night had drained them, but a sense of grim determination had settled in as well. They knew they couldn't stay another night, not after what they'd seen. "We're leaving," Daniel said firmly, his voice low and resolute. "We'll pack whatever we can carry and go. I don't care how far we have to walk. We'll find help." Sarah nodded, feeling a flicker of relief. Anything was better than spending another night in this place, listening to the twisted, mocking voices outside. She grabbed Jamie's hand, giving it a comforting squeeze. "We're getting out of here, honey. Just stay close, okay?" Jamie nodded, her eyes wide but filled with a silent determination that made Sarah's heart ache. She was so young, yet the fear had forced her to grow up in a matter of hours. They moved quickly, packing only the essentials: water, snacks, a flashlight. Daniel double-checked the front door, ensuring they could leave swiftly, while Sarah collected the last few items from Jamie's room. But as she reached for Jamie's backpack, something caught her eye: a small, leather-bound journal tucked beneath the bed. She hadn't noticed it before, and she was certain it hadn't been there when they'd arrived. It was old, the leather cracked and faded, as though it had been left behind years ago. Curious, she flipped it open, her gaze falling on the first page, where a name was scrawled in neat, looping letters: Carl Finley. Her breath caught in her throat. The caretaker. Had he left this here? She skimmed the first few entries, her heart pounding as she read. June 5th. The cabin has been empty for months now, and the forest feels restless. The old stories keep circling in my mind: the Skinwalker. I used to think it was just superstition, but the signs are here. June 15th. I saw it last night. It looked like my brother, but I knew it wasn't him. It watched me from the edge of the woods, shifting between shapes, testing my resolve. The thing doesn't kill quickly. It toys with you, waits until you're broken. This land, it's cursed. Sarah's hands shook as she continued reading, dread pooling in her stomach. July 1 est. I've tried to warn the others who come here, but they never believe me. They think it's all a story. They don't understand that once the Skinwalker marks you, it doesn't stop until it gets what it wants. It feeds on fear, on desperation. If you see it, if you hear it, it's already too late. A cold realization dawned on her. Carl had known. He'd known exactly what this creature was capable of, and he'd left his warning here, though he hadn't expected anyone to heed it. She stuffed the journal into her bag, her hands trembling as she rejoined Daniel and Jamie. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes must have told Daniel everything he needed to know. "Let's go," he said, taking her hand and guiding them out the front door. The escape. The family moved quickly, staying close together as they followed the winding path that led away from the cabin and back toward the road. The forest loomed on all sides, a dense wall of shadows that seemed to shift and sway, watching their every move. As they walked, the silence grew oppressive. There were no bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every so often, she glanced over her shoulder, catching glimpses of shapes flitting between the trees, dark figures that vanished the moment she looked directly at them. Jamie clung to her hand, her small fingers digging into Sarah's palm, but she didn't complain, her face set with a quiet, frightened determination. They reached a small clearing, where a faint path branched off to the left. Daniel paused, glancing down at the map he'd brought, frowning. "The main road should be this way," he murmured, though he sounded uncertain. Sarah's heart pounded as she looked down both paths. They seemed identical, stretching into the shadowed distance with no distinguishing features. Then a familiar voice echoed from the path to the left, startling them all. "Mom, Dad, wait." They turned, their blood running cold. A figure was running toward them, a figure that looked exactly like Jamie, dressed in her blue jacket, her braids bouncing as she sprinted toward them, her face twisted with panic. "Mom, please, don't leave me," the figure cried, her voice trembling with fear. Sarah's grip tightened on the real Jamie's hand, her heart hammering in her chest. She looked down, ensuring her daughter was still with her, then back at the figure. The resemblance was perfect, down to the smallest detail, but she knew, with a sickening certainty, that it wasn't Jamie. The figure skidded to a stop a few feet away, its face crumpling in a twisted imitation of despair. "Mom, why won't you help me?" It sobbed, its voice raw and pleading. "I'm your daughter." Sarah fought the urge to respond, to reach out, but she knew better. "It's a trick," she reminded herself, her mind flashing back to the words in Carl's journal. "It feeds on fear, on desperation." Daniel's voice was firm as he placed himself between Sarah and the figure. "You're not her," he said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. "We're not falling for it." The figure's expression twisted, its face stretching and contorting, shifting into a grotesque imitation of Jamie's likeness. It let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes narrowing with fury. Then, slowly, it backed away, disappearing into the shadows, its form shifting, elongating, until it looked more like an animal than a child. They didn't wait. Daniel took Sarah's hand, and they ran, their footsteps pounding against the forest floor as they raced down the path, not daring to look back. But the forest didn't let them go easily. The shadows around them shifted, twisted, and the sounds of footsteps echoed from every direction, closing in on them. They heard their own voices calling, pleading, mocking, all around them. "Come back, don't leave. Mom, Dad, please." The voices grew louder, more frantic, as if the creature could sense their resolve weakening, their fear rising. Jamie stumbled, and Sarah pulled her close, lifting her into her arms as they pushed forward, Daniel leading the way. At last, they reached the road, a narrow, gravel-strewn path that stretched through the forest like a lifeline. The sight of it filled Sarah with a surge of hope, and they scrambled onto it, barely stopping to catch their breath. But as they looked back, they saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching them with cold, unblinking eyes. Its shape was human, but its limbs were too long, its features stretched and distorted, a monstrous parody of a person. It didn't move. It simply stood there, its gaze following them with a chilling, unspoken promise. Daniel took Sarah's hand, and they turned away, walking down the road without looking back. Creature didn't follow, but they could feel its presence, lingering in the shadows, watching. They walked for hours, until they finally emerged from the forest and saw the lights of a small town glimmering in the distance. As they reached the safety of the town, Sarah glanced back one last time, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the nightmare hadn't ended. The Skinwalker was still out there, waiting, haunting the shadows of the forest, biding its time. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would always be waiting, watching just beyond the light. The Last Cabin Epilogue. Weeks had passed since the Davis family left the cabin, but the shadows of that night clung to them, following them back into their lives like a dark stain they couldn't scrub away. They'd return to the city, to the comforting hum of streetlights and bustling crowds. Yet, Despite the familiar surroundings, the unease remained. Sarah felt it most in the quiet moments, the stretches of silence in the dead of night when she'd caught herself listening, as though expecting to hear that twisted echo of Jamie's voice calling from just beyond the walls. Daniel had thrown himself into his work, staying late at the office or finding excuses to keep busy around the house. But Sarah could see the haunted look in his eyes, the way his gaze drifted to the windows at dusk, as though waiting for something to appear. Jamie, though young, hadn't escaped unscathed. She'd become quiet and withdrawn, sleeping with the light on and clutching her stuffed owl close to her chest. She often asked to sleep in her parents' room, her small voice trembling as she whispered about the voice in the woods and how it still haunted her dreams. One evening, as Sarah was tucking Jamie into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide, fearful eyes. "Mom," she whispered, "what if it's still looking for us?" Sarah felt a chill settle over her. "It can't hurt us anymore, honey," she said softly, though the words felt hollow, as if she were trying to convince herself. "We're safe here." Jamie nodded, but her gaze drifted to the window, and Sarah noticed her daughter's hands trembling as she pulled the blanket up to her chin. She stayed with Jamie until her breathing slowed, her fears momentarily calmed by the warmth of her mother's presence. But later that night, as Sarah lay in bed, her mind drifted back to Carl's journal, to the warning scrawled in his careful handwriting. "Once the Skinwalker marks you, it doesn't stop until it gets what it wants." A shiver crept down her spine as she recalled the way it had mimicked their voices, their faces, taunting and luring them deeper into the forest. She could still hear it, that pleading, desperate voice calling out from the shadows. She rolled over, pressing herself against Daniel, seeking comfort in his warmth. But just as she began to drift off, a soft, faint sound reached her ears. A whisper, distant and haunting, slipping through the quiet of their bedroom. "Mom, Dad, wait for me." Sarah's eyes flew open, her heart racing. She sat up, straining to listen, but the voice had gone, swallowed by the darkness. Beside her, Daniel stirred, his brow furrowing in his sleep. She hesitated, glancing at the window, half expecting to see a small figure standing there, watching. But there was nothing, only the stillness of the night and the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. She lay back down, forcing herself to close her eyes. But as sleep claimed her, one thought lingered in her mind, a thought she couldn't shake. The Skinwalker was still out there, waiting, watching, and it would always be.
I hope you enjoyed the story. Like and subscribe for more. Thank you for wandering the foggy paths of Mistmoor with us. Stay curious, but beware what you may uncover in the mist. Farewell, brave souls from Mistmoor Mysteries.